Welcome to an honest conversation on the Jewish question. Please like, comment, subscribe below if you think these conversations are important, because the numbers are not looking good. Close to 50% rise in anti-Semitic incidents in the US over 2017, almost a doubling since 2015, 75% up in France, 60% rise in Australia. Communities are living in fear. People are drawing parallels to the 1930s. And interestingly, Jews respond in different ways. Some respond in defiance, we shall stand tall, kind of, or they are waging counterattacks in the media. Some, specifically in Israel, are actually ignoring this altogether. Some ascribe it to ignorance, fear, envy. There's all sorts of conflicting definitions of Jews, and consequently all the conflicting reasons for why people hate Jews in the first place. And almost everyone agrees it's a real thing, it's a real problem, but almost no one agrees on the underlying reason for it. And we want to get to the bottom of this, and we want to keep this conversation real. So with me for these talks is Dr. Laitman, PhD in biocybernetics and the foremost authority on the science of Kabbalah and its surprising explanation of the Jewish problem. He's lecturing and talking about the topic in his book, Like a Bundle of Reeds, Why Unity and Mutual Guarantee Are the Call of the Hour, is full of, quite honestly, surprising information about the Jews and their history, something sometimes bordering network science. So it really is an unusual approach. And I'm inviting people here to talk about this issue and to challenge the views of Kabbalah, maybe agree even, I don't know. And all the way from Australia, actually in Australia, is audio personality, satirist, documentary maker, wicked actor, smart prankster, and author of Depends What You Mean by Extremist by Mr. John Safran. So hi, John.
Shalom and g'day.
Shalom and g'day to you.
I'm really showing the multifaceted nature of my identity.
That's good. That's good. John, I want to actually start with you because in your work, from what I gathered, you really push the envelope on what people believe in and how people broadcast their beliefs to each other, their friends, their family, and those who oppose their beliefs. And you went far left, you went far right. You've made it your business to meet with some extreme parts of society, sometimes with hilarious results, I must say. But really beneath the kind of the sarcasm and everything, I would like to know, what did you find? Do you feel you are closer to understanding why people hate the Jews? Why did this thing hasn't gone away? Did you find a real reason for this persisting problem underneath the generally confused state of people in the world today? We want to start with you. Tell us.
Well, I think the confusing thing is there's so many layers to it. So there's aspects to anti-Semitism where it's like other forms of bigotry. So, and the way other forms of bigotry often work is you identify a human flaw or a human shortcoming, but then you only notice it in your ethnic enemy and really always bring it up when your ethnic enemy is showing this universal human flaw, but then not mentioning it when your own group shows that flaw or any other group shows that flaw. So there's that aspect to it. But there is this confusing aspect to it where people seem to bend over backwards in some circumstances to have a problem with the Jews. And I find that very confusing. And so when it comes to the far right, often that's a bit easier to get your head around, I guess. And it's also a bit, even though it's awful, it can be a bit more relaxing than left-wing or Muslim anti-Semitism, because when it comes to like neo-Nazis, so many people are on your side. Are on our side, the Jews. If there's these Nazis marching down the street, left-wing people will be on our side, Muslim people will be on our side. There'll be a whole raft, but then it gets a bit weird and complicated if it's left-wing anti-Semitism or at least left-wing antagonism towards the Jews, and then also Muslim antagonism towards the Jews. And that can be for all numbers of reasons because, as soon as you throw Israel-Palestine conflict into things, then all this statics there, and it's really hard to unpick, what's the valid criticism and what's the not the valid criticism of people in the Jewish community who might be bigoted themselves towards, Arabs or Muslims or Palestinians or whatever, and how do you unpick it all? And then there's this new one where the left has surveyed the scene of the modern world with the growth of the alt-right and all of the anti-Semitic tropes out there, and they've decided there's not enough out there. Let's introduce some new ones. And the main new one that the left have introduced is problematizing Jews as white. So they remove the specific nature of our history, the specific nature of how our enemies relate to us, and kind of dissolve us into as if we're just white. And therefore, if someone's just white in the modern world, in the modern woke world, it's that, for instance, there's no such thing as, you can't be racist to white people. You can only be racist to non-white people, and Jews were white in their estimation. And then there's things such as, well, white people have power. So therefore, if you're racist against powerful people, that racism doesn't exist. And in the case of Jews, it becomes really confusing, because if they create the argument that Jews, are doing okay, they're middle class and they have they've often got the benefit of middle class, but not always. I mean, Jews, it should be stressed, at least in Australia, I've looked at the numbers and there's just poor Jews, So anyway, but that's a bit of a side point. And if Jews are often middle class and if Jews are white, then, and if there's no way to be racist against middle class or white people, then anti-Semitism can't exist. So, yeah, it's just a landmine and a tangle, and you have people who are antagonistic towards Jews, and I think that they just don't get it. So I don't think they're being it on purpose, like they're good-natured lefties or maybe good-natured Muslims or whatever. But then there's ones that are definitely being antagonistic towards Jews. And even the word anti-Semitism, I wish there was a word where in the grayer area, because it's sort of like, it's such a heated, powerful word that obviously applies to, the Nazis putting Jews in ovens and the Spanish Inquisition and the New Testament saying the blood of Christ is on the hands of all the descendants of the Jews who killed Christ and stuff. So it's such a heated thing. But then there's this antagonism towards the Jews, which I really wish we'd come up with a new word for, because then we might be able to have a conversation with people. So I'll give you an example. Your friend over there at the moment, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, that politician.
Yeah.
And she recently said that the conditions that immigrants were being treated with in their detention centres was equivalent to the concentration camps. Right. And she was never again the Jewish. It's the equivalent to the Holocaust, right? And I was thinking when I was hearing that, I'm going, well, she could have said it's the equivalent of the slave ships that the black people were forced over to come to America. She could have said this is the equivalent of the lynching of black people during the Jim Crow era, but she didn't. And I'm not saying she thinks about this. I think it's all subconscious, but she just has an intuition that's unnecessarily antagonistic towards black Americans. She has an intuition that, because if she did that, undeniably, some black Americans would complain, and they'd be just like the Jews are complaining, and they'd say, what are you doing this for? And she intuitively knows that that's not good for her brand, having black Americans calling her racist or whatever. And so why? But she's willing to do that for the Jews.
Again, the Jews are singled out.
And the Jews are singled out for this thing that's got really no direct line to the Jews whatsoever. So anyway, and that's an example of something which I wish there was a word for, this kind of like this casual antagonism, and hypocritical, I think, is the word I'm looking for. It'd be different. I mean, there's people out there who are just antagonistic to everyone. Like there's this journalist, and people like I don't even agree with, but like some journalists like Glenn Greenwald, for instance, right? I'm not really across him much, but he's antagonistic towards the Jews on his own, but he's kind of like a bit all over the place. So it's just like, I'm fine. If you're spreading the antagonism, okay. But yeah, if you're stepping on eggshells around every other minority, and yet you somehow always finding yourself being antagonistic to the Jewish community, I just wish there was a word for that. That wasn't anti-Semitism. Maybe jerks to the Jews. We need something like that, where you're just being a bit of a jerk.
So the question is, do you feel that this attitude toward Jews is really just one of many attitudes of discontent, of just general hate, this general allergy that exists in society, or is there something particular that you felt like yourself?
Oh yeah, I did not absolutely. In the same way that in the same way that there's a specific way that just say racism to Indigenous people is specific and kind of different in its way to like just racism against Asian Australians or whatever. In the same way that there are things that are like specific about anti-Semitism that I just find really distasteful, and I find it the most distasteful from the left because of the hypocrisy, where they're stepping on eggshells these days around everything, which fine, respect personal pronouns and all that. And it's like, well, if you're going to go down that path of stepping on eggshells around every other minority, it's like, if that's your shtick, step on eggshells around the Jews. So it's almost like the left-wing antagonism towards the Jews has made me think there is something weird about anti-Semitism that's specific, because why are they just so bending over backwards? Sorry, this is what I experienced when writing my book, and I didn't go into it thinking I'd experience this, where there's just this hypocritical bending over backwards to antagonize the Jews.
Okay, I want to go to Dr. Laitman.
Look, I'm researching this phenomenon for a long time and looking at it over the span of history of thousands of years. The history of Jews, the origins of Jews, begins more or less 3,500 years ago in ancient Babylon. And so it's not about left or right or this group or that group and this society or that culture or people in our time. That's just things that are happening today. What we're looking at here is a phenomenon of a hatred towards a people that, as a researcher, I'm looking at it very differently. This is not a phenomenon that just erupted all of a sudden. It originates in ancient Babylon, which was the cradle of human civilization. When most of humanity was centralized there, it went through a big crisis, a social crisis. That Babylonian crisis, which is symbolized sometimes as the Tower of Babel. What happened was that people felt an eruption of human egoism, and that made people more alienated towards each other. And so those mostly 70 groups, 70 nations that existed there, they all came from there, but there was another group that was collected there, which was assembled by Abraham. He was an ideologue, he was a spiritual leader, he was a Babylonian leader. And he told people of all groups, of all tribes, clans, and nations, he told them, let's come together and try to rise above the human ego and live in social harmony. And he put together a group. That group was later called the people of Israel. The name Israel also comes from a combination of two words, Yashar El, which means directly towards that force of connection. Or it's also according to that maxim that we all know, love thy neighbor as thyself. That was actually the group that surrounded Abraham. And that was a group of people who started behaving according to a different motto, a different principle of positive connection, even to the point of love of man, above the growing differences and eruption of egoism. And that group existed that way for about 1500 years, until there was a shattering, which is what we know as the ruin of the temple. But what it actually means is that they started fighting, the ego has erupted among them as well. They started dispersing and moving apart from each other. Rifts began to happen between them to the point that their hatred increased to the point that the leader at that time, called Rabbi Akiva, he was trying to tell everyone, let's go back to this principle of love thy friend as thyself, rising above the hatred, above the ego, but no one listened anymore. And then that group was eventually ultimately scattered in all directions of the planet. And since then, we're in what's called exile. We don't actually have we didn't have our own country, and we don't have our own nationhood, because that nation of Israel emerged from the collection of all those nations that existed in Babylon. Their unity, their nationhood, was not based on the biological connection like every other nation had, which was like a mother and father that eventually procreated and created descendants, etc. The people of Israel don't have that kind of blood connection. It's an ideological connection. And if the ideology stops putting people together, then they scatter, because they no longer feel that something ties them to each other. However, if there's hatred from outside towards them, then it keeps them together, like a flock of sheep, if you will, like a herd. And otherwise, they'll scatter in all directions, and you see one in Australia, one in Israel, one in New York, and so on. And that's why we have no problem to find ourselves integrating with all the different societies and nations. However, today we're in a special time, because the historical process reaches a point where all of humanity grows in its human ego, and that is blowing up all of the human connections that we have socially, nationally, between countries, between in terms of trade and commerce. You can see this in the European Union, for example. The human ego grows to the point where people can no longer cooperate properly and can't stand each other on a personal level. Hatred increases, animosity increases. And in that state, nations of the world are looking towards that group, the people of Israel. They have an inherent sentiment that there is something unique and weird and strange about this group of people. They, the other nations, can understand each other because they emerge from a similar root, from the same origins. The people of Israel, however, are a group that comes from all those nations and only holds itself together by their higher level of human connection that they once had. Today we're at a point where the nations of the world feel a certain growing hatred towards us. And they're right for feeling it, because it comes from the fact that we can demonstrate a method of human existence on a higher level. And they sense that this is not happening. It is a subconscious thing that they sense that we are somehow creating troubles and problems, or at least not making them go away. They don't exactly know what we're supposed to give to them, and we don't know either, but they sense that something is held by the Jews in that human network, and we don't understand what it is. We too don't understand why they hate us. We don't. But the deeper reason for it is because we're not creating that higher level of unity that method of human connection that the world needs increasingly. And that's why we're seeing this happening again, and we're once again seeing indications like we saw in the Holocaust. But this time it will be a different thing, and it's no longer contained in a specific country. It's something that grows across the globe. And it will grow worse unless we will begin to demonstrate what the world expects with it, which is this method of higher human connection between us. When the Jews begin to do that, the world will sense that something's happening, that something is happening in the human network, and this antagonism towards us will subside. Let's try and see. This is something Kabbalists have been talking about for over 3,000 years. Please ask questions if you want.
So, before I ask you a question, just one clarification about the Australian situation. Australia, we've got a mainstream left-wing party, a mainstream right-wing party, so, roughly the Democrats and the Republicans or whatever, but our version of that. And I feel that in the centre space, there's not a lot of antagonism towards the Jews. I think they're in Australia. But my point is, as soon as you go just edge a little to the left or a little to the right outside that centre, that's where people instantly go towards the Jews, and which I found really surprising. So I guess a couple of questions to ask you. One is, an atheist would say, "Oh no, people are just hating the Jews because of the occupation, the Israel-Palestine conflict, and so as soon as that goes away, then we won't be antagonistic towards the Jews anymore." By the way, and my little commentary...
Yeah, but what happened before that, John? What happened before this was even a reality, the occupation and all that? What are we talking about? The last 50 years? This hatred exists way before.
No, you're right. And my experience is that even after that, this whole new language where suddenly the Jews are problematic because they're white, because that's got nothing to do with the Israel-Palestine conflict. And here we're Jews in Australia.
True, exactly.
If it was all about Israel, we'd be having these left-wing people saying these hard. Thank God, like you were just such good Jews because you're not in Israel, and that was our only problem. But now this gear shift where they're using this modern language of woke and this modern language of to find a further problem with the Jews means I do agree with you that this thing goes beyond just the Israel-Palestine conflict. But then what would happen if that was solved? I don't even know how that would be solved, though. I'm not an expert or whatever. How do you think things would be?
It will be solved. It can be solved only on the condition that group, the people of Israel, the Jews, will begin to actually connect between them. They need to develop care for all Jews across the world, wherever they are, Australia, America, Europe, Israel. They need to rekindle that sense of one group, one nation. They have to sense that connection between them, and that connection sustains the world. The world depends on that connection. It's needed for that network of humanity. Otherwise, that network is reaching a crisis. That's where we're going now, today. The ego of all of mankind, it is a natural force that's growing repeatedly, daily, day by day, and it pushes people apart. Everyone becomes more antagonistic towards each other. Hatred increases in general, but if those Jews, that group, begins like hubs of connection, begin to connect, they can enable connection for the whole network, for the whole world. That's the root cause of anti-Semitism as well as the solution.
And what's an example of a Kabbalistic ritual or a Kabbalistic practice that the Jews should be participating in? That's different to just rocking up to synagogue or rapping on a tefillin today.
No. All of that nonsense. Forget all the rituals, synagogues, all of that. It's beyond that. What we're talking about here is an inherent connection that we have to develop between us. We have to feel our responsibility for both that people of Israel and the whole world. That's why, in fact, you don't need to take into account the white supremacists, the leftists, the rightists, the liberals, the ultra, all of that. Don't take that into account even. They don't understand what's going on. It's like puppets on strings in that sense. Everything depends on you. And that's what they're trying to tell you through their hatred. Look at 10 million people in the world, Jews, right? 15 million, let's say. Look what's happening, how the whole world is gradually directing their attention to them, to us. We have to understand that our behavior influences the world, and that's what they essentially are saying. Anti-Semitism is basically saying, you're important, you're not doing something you're supposed to do. You understand?
When you're telling me this, I'm reminded of the story of Job, where Job was being punished, but he wasn't being punished by just Satan on his own, whatever, disconnected from God. It was God who had subcontracted Satan to test Job. Are you saying that Hashem, that God is somehow subcontracting these white nationalists and these anti-Semitic lefties to kind of test us?
John, I see that you are very Jewish, very knowledgeable in also religion, but I'll tell you, it's true. But I see this as a law of nature. It's true that there's biblical stories in the scriptures and all of that, but what I'm looking at this from is how nature works. Nature is an integrated system. It's an interconnected whole system. This is also something that I've learned from my first profession, biocybernetics, which is the operating systems of human nature, starting from the human body and all the way, through all the spheres of the universe. What we have to understand is that there are laws here that are immutable. Human egoism is growing. That's an evolutionary process. It has to happen. On the other hand, this natural system that we're living in is integrated, it's interconnected, and that it forces us to be interdependent as well. Otherwise, we'll ruin the planet. We're not going to... See what's happening right now. If humanity continues down this road, we don't have much time left. What I'm saying in this process is that this group called Jews have a certain function they're responsible for in this natural system that we're all living in. And that's because they emerged from a unity of all nations, all the nationalities that you have in the world by nature, by origin. The Jews are sort of like a concentration of all nations. That's how they emerged, that's how they were naturally created in ancient Babylon. And that's why if they create unity in that sort of model group, that will reverberate across the world, that will ripple throughout the world, and then animosity and hatred and fascism and extremism will subside. Everything will move towards balance. That's why all of this depends on us. And that's why there's hatred towards us that will keep rising and rising if we won't do that. I was talking about this dozens of years ago, decades ago. But you see, what's happening is only that anti-Semitism, unfortunately, sadly, is rising because we're not delivering that correction that needs to happen.
I have here from this book, a bundle of reeds. There's this quote, I'm kind of reading quickly through it, Dr. Laitman. It says, imagine you have found a series of exercises that heal cancer and prevent it from returning. Imagine you had told the world about it, as did Abraham in Babylon, but you were rejected because the exercises were monotonous and tiring and no one really felt unwell. Now imagine that years later, billions of people around the world would have cancer. They vaguely remember that you said that you had a cure, And in their desperation, they turn to you, begging you to save their lives. But you have forgotten all about it. You know the cure exists. You know that many people said it was a powerful remedy. But since you feel strong and healthy, you see no reason why you should relearn those exercises, much less teach them to billions of people. Can you imagine how the world would feel about you, what people would think, and what they would do? So I'm wondering, John, I mean, in talking to people, do you, and also just looking at yourself, do you feel that somehow the Jewish people themselves are part of this, or like, do you
part of the problem?
Part of the problem, like, yeah, that they have a certain responsibility, as Kabbalah says. I'm curious if that feeling ever dawned on you in any way.
Well, I feel that it can be helpful that people, and it's just inevitable that people are going to be in tribes of whatever sort, and then within that tribe they can, bond together to be good and be a light unto the nation. But whether Jews are the only ones who can do that, that doesn't seem. It seems like lots of groups can be lights unto nations.
It's unfair. Dr. Laitman, why is that? Why? I think we asked about it in another talk we had. How come only one group can do it? Only this group called the Jewish people. How come only they can do it?
Look, Jews, Jewish, Yehudi, comes from the word yichud, which means unity. It's that group that was unified in the cradle of civilization to become this meta-nation. It's an artificial nation. It's not it's just like you went to the scripture, so just like the scripture says, Israel is not listed among the nations. What does that mean? It is as though an artificial creation, a connection between all the other nations. Or if you want, like it says about Mount Sinai, today you have been made as a nation, not before. What do these things mean? By that status, that state, which is represented as Mount Sinai. That group received a method of connection. They were able to connect on a higher human level. And that's why you cannot put that responsibility on any other group in humanity. The laws of nature will one way or another pressure us to deliver that connection and that unity and demonstrate it to the world. That's the true meaning of being a light unto the nations, to show that, exemplify that human connection, which is becoming more and more necessary in our time. There is no other way.
I'm interested in what, after I put down the microphone and turn off the computer, what I do. Okay, if I decide to become a piece of plasticine in your hands, and I'll just, follow your path of this, this Kabbalah thing, like, what actually am I meant to do?
No, that's not how you can do it. First of all, your last name is Safran, right? It actually represents something very important. It's very possible that you come from a lineage of wise people. Not you specifically, but those who your ancestors.
Yes.
No, but there were people who were specifically connected to literature and writing and the basis of the wisdom, of Jewish wisdom. You should know, I'm not attracting anyone to try to follow me. I would, for sure, if you want, I can give you books and the authentic books of Kabbalah, not even my books. The point is that we need to understand what we belong to, what is our root, what is our origin, and it's with respect to not just us, but towards the world. There's a process here that it's not about the life that you have in your biological body only, where you live and die and that's it. There is a system here that is working, and it's greater than our small, narrow perception. It's a shattered system that is coming to its completion, coming to its correction. It goes beyond the life that we're familiar with in this lifespan that we have. Kabbalah is a science. It is a science. I recommend you to first get to know it, understand what it is, and then you'll see for yourself how you can realize it and what you can do in your own place. I'll be happy to assist you if you want. We have a lot of material. We can send you, we have a lot of material in English if you want. If you're interested, you can definitely look into it. But then you will see for yourself. And by the way, you'll have a lot of stuff to talk about towards people, the public, and you can come up, I'm sure, with all kinds of ideas of your own and creative ideas on how to present different things that has to do with that. I wish you all the best in that.
I think, Dr. Laitman, I think the question I have it, and I think people watching that as well. These talks, and I speak to Jewish people, all the time. I'm married to a Jewish person. The question is always, not Kabbalah, but how do we connect? What is that connection that we have to execute between us? Right? I think that's the next kind of question. You're saying it will calm everything down. People will start, looking at Jews as a positive force, not a negative force in the system. But what does it mean to connect? Do we have to throw parties for people? Do we have to have dinners together? What does it mean? How do we...
No. A person who begins to rise above the ego that separates human beings begins to sense the general inclusive force of nature and the system of connection that binds us together. When he begins to sense that force and how it operates, and as I said, it's beyond the biological life that starts and ends with our body. He begins to recognize an eternal system, a higher force that operates the system that we're familiar with here in our world. That's the discovery that has to happen in our evolution. The eternity of nature exists there. The essence of life exists there. What is this life for? What's the meaning of life? Nothing we see in nature is created for no reason. And so, still, the vegetative, the animate, the human, all levels of nature exist for a purpose. So what's the purpose of humans? Is the purpose being just spending our life dividing between each other or engaging in politics or whatever it is? We don't understand what is the purpose of human existence. What the wisdom of Kabbalah explains is that through that higher connection with everything, we can rise to a higher level of existence, to a greater perception of reality. And it's an eternal reality. And then different fluctuations of this world begin to have less effect on you. And you discover the system that operates everything. These are very lofty things, but even just getting a taste of them raises you to a whole different level of life. But what we talked about now is a whole different thing. To keep things on a simple level, the problems that we see in our world, anti-Semitism, what I can say is that this will increase, it will grow worse, the problems will increase, Jews will be haunted everywhere, chased in every corner. We won't be able to escape this because this law of nature needs to happen. And so they will pressure us through the whole network. Nature works and makes this connection of the whole system happen. So subconsciously they work that way. They don't understand why, but they feel this negative sentiment towards us. And it's a deep-seated demand for that higher connection, for that force of connection that can only come through that group of the people of Israel, if they unite. And we'll have to realize the laws of nature after all. I hope that if you're interested, you look at some materials, and if you're interested, and if you want to hear more, if you want to have more conversations, I'll be happy to.
Cool. Well, one last question, at least from me, is that so are golems, is that part of Kabbalah? Like golems?
Look, there are many allegories and nice stories, but there is no hocus pocus. There is no magic. There are laws of nature. That's what there is. If you take the authentic Kabbalistic writings from even thousands of years ago, and those that exist throughout history closer to our time, you can find many different stories, allegories, but there are no miracles. There are simply laws of nature. When I don't understand laws of nature, then I call it a miracle. But it's just because I don't understand the actual root cause, the inner workings of the laws of nature. But there are laws for everything that's happening. So the story of the golem and the pharaoh, all those things, they actually discuss something that you can call very materialistic. And that's the essence of the wisdom of Kabbalah. That's what it really is.
I'm curious, John, did you ever feel like, after meeting all those people and growing up, very Jewish, with very Jewish roots, did you ever feel like you wish you were not Jewish? You could just be like everyone else? Has it ever crossed your mind? Because I know...
No, not at all. I know I've got superficial, what's the word? Like maybe appearance, or maybe like of being like, because comedians are meant to be like self-loathing Jews or whatever, but it's just never really been like that. I can't explain why. I guess so that's the good news, I guess. But I've never felt. I went to a state school, so just a secular state primary school, and it was just totally pleasant in regard to being Jewish. So, for instance, around Christmas time, I'd get up and everyone have to talk about what they do, and I'd stand up and talk about Hanukkah, and it just never occurred to me. Like it was much later on that, like, I started realizing I just had a very fortunate primary school education.
So I'm curious, Dr. Abin, this for you, last question, because John, I watched some of your race relations episode, and really funny stuff. And in one of them, you have a flashback to that high school retreat. And then later on in that episode, there's a part where the rabbi is putting on tefillin on your younger self, and he asks you, do you know who were the last Jews to be put on the trains to Auschwitz? And you shrug, and he says it was the Jews that tried to convert to Christianity, that they put them as well. And he says they thought they managed to change, but everyone still saw them as Jews. And anti-Semitism will always get you. Like you say that, it's said in there. So, Dr. Laitman, the question is this just a kind of a folk tale, something Jews have been telling themselves? Or is this like, if someone is the Jew, which we need to probably clarify exactly what it is later at some future, talk, but is it like you're stuck for life? There's no way to change that to...
Jew comes from the word yichud, which is again unity. That's what we need to realize. There is actually nothing in our basis besides that. That is the origin of the Jewish religion that later was created, later. Love thy friend as thyself is the law of nature that needs to be realized. Everything else is just cultural symbols that are trying to represent that. But if we don't carry out the inner law, if we don't follow the laws, then none of it exists, and that group of Israel will scatter. What Abraham taught, and this is written by the Rambam almost 1,000 years ago, Abraham taught the people that came to him only one thing, that love covers all differences, all crimes. Meaning the people who came to Abraham were from all the different nations in the cradle of civilization. And he elevated them to a higher level of connection. That's what it means that he made them all brothers, etc., that all Israel are friends, etc. The love covers all crimes. That's a practical thing that he taught them how to do, and today it is a law that needs to eventually be realized across the world, and that's why the wisdom of Kabbalah is also gradually, through different means, is becoming revealed and popular. And it's because we've come to a point where this human connection has to happen across all of humanity. Gradually, it has to happen. Otherwise, nations of the world will force us and pressure us to the point that horrible things can happen, even worse than what we've seen, such as the Holocaust. So we have to discuss this, we have to publicize it, and we have to try to realize it. That's what is expected from us. Let's do the opposite. Let's start connecting, let's start demonstrating, let's start publicizing this and demonstrate it, and you'll see that everything subsides. As, by the way, like it's written in Isaiah, the prophet, that the nations of the world will carry the people of Israel on their shoulders and take them to their place, to the holy state. Meaning, we will have received support if we do that, instead of hatred. Connection and love and support instead of hatred.
Okay. Wow, time flew by. Thanks for taking the time.
I hope that maybe John can turn this into even a comedy, because comedy is great. Comedy, surpasses people's criticism, and it makes them actually hear more. So good luck. I'll be happy to talk to you more if you're interested. Thank you both.
Thank you very much to both of you, and Dr. Laitman, thank you very much. I learned a lot. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, everyone, really, Dr. Laitman, John, and everyone else. Like, share, comment, subscribe, all of that. We want to hear more. Keep having those honest conversations. Thank you.
See you later.